Hi, I'm Walter, and this is Helicopter Lesson in 15 minutes. Today we're going to talk about instrument gauges focused on the engine and rotor, and after that the second lesson, so it'll be apart from this, we'll look at all of the other instrumentations. So I know this can be quite overwhelming as you initially sit in the cockpit and look at, oh my lord, what are all these gauges, uh, often referred to as steam gauges. These are the round dials on the dashboard itself. Of course, if you have a new aircraft, these might all be mostly digitized, um, like a Garmin 1000 or in GNX or other types of things out there. But again, essentially speaking, they all collect information from different components and they give you insight to how things are functioning. So this is really concentrated and focused on the engine and rotor. And again, like I said, we're going to talk about all of the other instruments in a separate lesson from that. The key thing to the instrumentation is that actually it is vitally important, right, for you to be able to get knowledge of that before something happens. So these are, sometimes leading indicators. If something is in the, at or near the yellow or red, that you have to start investigating, right? You have to start taking action to that. Don't take the gauges for granted. Don't just take that as a given that there's nothing else, that's perfect. Everything else is normal. It is about feeling as well. And I will tell you, as a new pilot, your feeling of the aircraft is really, minimal. If you have thousands of hours in a particular aircraft, your feelings are optimized, right? So you can actually start feeling vibrations coming from different parts of your body or from the seat you're sitting in that might give you indications that something is or is not right. So again, the basics for us is that we always look at the engine and rotor RPMs, the tachometer, right? That is, and they're both in the same. As you can see in the right hand corner over here, you have one on the left side is the engine, the right side is the rotor. But it is it's referred to as a dual tach, right? So it's the engine and the rotor should be married during normal operations. So as the rotor goes up, the engine goes up. Now, there are things that we're going to be testing, like on your check sheet, but once the engine is warmed up, once we have the temperatures in the green area, the yellow into green area, we will see if the spray clutch is working by reducing RPMs quickly to see if the rotor will disconnect from the engine itself, which is of course something you will need in case there is an emergency that requires you to enter an auto rotation. So that's a test that we do. But other than that moment in time, both the engine and rotor RPM needles should always be married from the bottom all the way to the top. So if you see them not being married, not connected, then that is an indication that something is not right, right? So be very, very mindful of that. The other unique thing is that the circuit breaker of the tachometer is on a unique circuit breaker outside of the normal electrical system, meaning that if something happens to the alternator, it will still continue to provide information, but only as long as the battery will last, and the battery power will only last about 20 minutes. Obviously, if you are insightful and you are aware, which you should, because you're losing other instrumentations like the radios, or maybe your digital displays, that there's a power failure, an alternator failure, you should be landing as soon as possible to prevent any other negative downsides. Again, managing your RPMs gives you insight to save flight itself. So on the tachometer, you will see three different colors: red, yellow, and green. Each one of them are going to be indicators, and there will be some fluctuations that you might see during flight itself, right? Especially in the rotor side, RPM side, and that is something you learned to manage. And we'll talk a little bit more about what type of warning systems we have in order to stay aware of that. On the engine side, however, it is something that we have to be mindful about because the throttle that we use with our left hand, we have a phenomenon, and I think we talked about in an earlier session, that if you ride motorcycles and you are used to revving the engine, that this could be problematic for the engine when you maybe you have to roll it up, you roll it off, right? And again, low engine RPM results in low rotor RPM, and low rotor RPM will lead to potential disaster. So that's something to be aware. On the flip side, you have to be very mindful about the fact that you don't overspeed it, that you push it, that you over twist it, and that it goes into the red on the top end, which again could cause damage to the engine components, which obviously results in an engine overspeed. Of course, we can also have a rotor overspeed. We'll talk about in a second. Okay, on the engine tach, which is the left side of the dual dial we just looked at, you see that right behind my picture over here, is a signal is provided by the right magneto. So there's a little fun fact, right? So the left magneto is used to start. The right magneto gives you indication of the RPMs on the engine itself. Again, mindful of overspeeding, right? When an engine operation is taking over the limits, over that 110%, right? It exceeds the limits of the helicopter components in the drive system. This is serious business, right? And actually, I was a witness to this when I was at Robbie School in California, where somebody accidentally, obviously, over throttled and caused the engine to go outside of the red, which required an internal inspection of components to be completed. Now, mind you, this was at the factory, so it was done pretty quickly. But if this is your helicopter, this can cause the helicopter to be out of service for days, if not weeks, right? Especially if it has to go back to the manufacturer. The readings on that, again, you see the colors are red, yellow, and green. Upper is 105 to 110. The red line is 104. And that's really, we should never exceed that period, right? The green arc is between 100 and 104. Now, you need to have really good eyes in order to be able to see it fluctuating. And it really should not go up and down more than just 1 or 2%. The lower red arc is 90 to 100%, which obviously does not give you enough power to maintain the rotor RPM. And again, it's all about rotor RPM over here, because that is ultimately giving you the lift in order to have safe flight. And of course, at the bottom of the yellow arc, 60 to 70%. But again, for flight, that is a no-go zone. That's just for warming up purposes. The rotor tach, which is the right side of the gauge itself, very similar to. You have different colors. The upper red line is 110%. And so, for example, one area when you start, obviously you're moving the rotor tachometer every time you're moving your collective, right? There's a potential of it to go slightly up or down. One of the areas of caution is when you are in turns, or when you're in auto rotation and in turns, or you have different wind conditions. You could have potential spiking of the rotor, RPM, and that is something we have to be hyper focused on. Again, an overspeed can happen with an abrupt collective input, or during flares when not properly monitored. Right? So we have to be very, very mindful of that. The blades are simply moving too fast for the drive system to withstand, and can affect the spindle bearings due to the excessive centrifugal forces that are applied. Again, this can be a very expensive. I think somebody told me something between $25,000 to $40,000 of a repair job if that happens. So again, use the student as the pilot, as the CFI. This is something you keep a very close eye on all of the time, right? So that this be very, very mindful about that. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is low rotor RPM, and this is something we have to be aware, because it is well documented that at 80% or less, or 80% plus 1% for every 1,000 feet of elevation, there is you will start losing the rigidity of the blades itself, and really starts losing that under 97%. But at 80% or less, it becomes detrimental. You will literally start falling out of the sky, because there's we cannot generate enough lift or the rigidity in the blades, which will lead to further rotor head stall and obviously disaster. If general knowledge is that if you're more than 40 to 60 feet off the ground and this happens, that the sudden drop can actually lead to serious injury, if not death. So this is something that we need to prevent at all times. So again, the manufacturer put in a light and a horn, and which you will be testing in a pre-flight, right? As soon as you start spinning up, before you take off, is one of the last things on your checklist you do, is that you go to full rotor RPM, and then you dial it back to 97%, and which the light and the horn should come on both, right? And you should have both in order to conduct a safe flight, right? We don't compromise on those safety standards. The manifold pressure is, of course, closely associated to this, and the manifold pressure gauge is a separate gauge. And interesting, when you see it sitting at idle, it's still when it's not turned on, the pressure is actually mimicking the pressure, the atmospheric pressure outside the aircraft. But as soon as you turn it on, you'll start seeing it makes an adjustment. And the adjustment is really a reading, right? The manifold is the chamber of where the pre-mixed air and fuel is mixed and distributed to the cylinders. It's measuring the pressure there. And in other words, it's giving us an indication how hard the engine is working. So that is important, of course, that we want to make sure that we don't over ask, right? That we don't pull too much power. And that's again the indicators you have in yellow and in red. So now we have max, continuous power, and then you have a 5-minute limitation that you can pull. Again, part of your pre-flight system, you have a checklist, and on that checklist there should be a couple of graphs. One thing, you need to look at the outside air temperature on what the max continuous manifold pressure setting is, plus X for a 5-minute maximum. Always calculate that, always verbalize that, or write it down. And then I would say if it says 25.6, then limit it at 25. Right? Because it's very difficult to look at a gauge and do that. So this is something that can easily be done by just when taking off, that especially when if you have some density issues, or it's a hot, humid day, you can easily pull too much power, right? And more is not better in this sense, right? It is that we really have to start, if you do if you're able to lift off at that max, setting at, let's say, 25 inches, if you exceed that, it's not going to give you more power. Now, remember we talked a little bit about the engine. We are underrated, right? So the rating of the ability of the engine is actually a little bit greater than what we are advertising, or what is advertised in the Pilot Operating Handbook. But again, this is not a good place to be. So be very, very mindful of that. And as the CFI, obviously you're sitting there with your left hand on the collective at all times, especially with newer students, so they don't have the ability to pull more power. And that's something you want to keep an eye outside, eye inside, outside, inside. And keeping an eye on the manifold pressure is one of the key things that you want to do in order to prevent overworking the engine at that point in time. So the gauges below in the center column are going to give you inside information on the is the engine functioning as designed. So the first thing we want to do as soon as we turn on the starter, so to speak, and we start turning the engine over, we want to keep a very close eye on oil pressure. Do we have oil pressure? Right? Because that will move immediately. The temperature and the cylinder head temperature, the oil temperature and cylinder head temperature, will take time. Right? It needs to have, be in motion for 2 to 3 minutes before you start seeing the temperatures coming up on that. But the oil pressure will have an immediate feedback. If you do not see any pressure, then immediately shut down. Right? It is something that we need to keep a close eye on, and the pressure should be in the green. And again, you have a yellow-red arch here as well that you need to. But again, it's very simple. If you are not in a green, then something might be wrong. Right? Shut down. Go ask a mechanic to take a look at it and verify this. As it comes to oil temperature, and for that matter also the cylinder head temperature, this is something that increases over a period of time, but also is a leading indicator that something might not be right. So in flight, if you see a sudden increase in cylinder head temperature and oil temperature, well, that might mean that there's not enough oil or something else is taking place. So again, as you scan your outside, right? You want to be outside most of the time. And then you scan your instruments, and we learned how to verbalize that. No lights on top, no lights on bottom. We have a green, 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 meaning we have green on the engine tachometer, green on the in the right place for manifold pressure. We have green oil pressure. We have green cylinder head temperature, green oil temperature, and we have enough fuel in the tank. Right? That's a kind of a systematic way of continuously looking at it as a scan to ensure that we are set up for safe flight and get into the habit of doing that early. And oil temperature and cylinder head temperatures are early indicators that an engine failure might take place. Right? Now, you can even see that if there's a single cylinder out of 4 on the 22 or 6 on the 44 are not functioning well. Again, look at these indicators and see. The other thing is, don't rush getting to max power until you are at least in the green, in other words, off the white lines on both cylinder head temperature and oil temperature. That oil coming up to temperature, the viscosity becomes just right to provide the right amount of lubrication and cooling to keep the engine within normal limits. And that is really important because you want that engine to last all of 2200 hours before it has to go for mandatory overhaul. I think that's it for this particular session. We're going to go to the pitot system and all of the other instrumentation in the next lesson. Again, thank you. I hope you got benefit out of it. If you have any questions, post it, like it, subscribe, follow, and share with your fellow pilots. And again, this is about conversation. I'm not the expert on everything, but this is about teaching myself and reminding myself of things that are important and that your responsibility as a pilot as well. Have a good day. We'll see you soon.